Good evening, everybody. Welcome. Wow. As Jacques, my friend and colleague, has pointed out in the chat, this is our Mark Twain House and Museum's first virtual program, first program of any kind in 2022. And how gratifying to see so many people here from all over. And I love that you're letting us know where you're from. So keep that going. Keep chatting in the chat. That's part of the fun of the virtual programs. I'm Jennifer LaRue. I am the host of tonight's program, and I'm so thrilled to see you all here. In a moment, I'll be introducing our guests, Thomas Crowl and Susan Campbell. And having spent a little bit of time with them in the green room and during a tech run, I guarantee you're in for a really fun and interesting conversation about Thomas's book, Queen of the Con. So we'll get to that in just a moment. I have just a little bit of housekeeping to do before we move on, so I'll try to keep it brief. First of all, again, thank you so much for being here with us this evening. The Mark Twain House and Museum deeply appreciates your participation throughout the pandemic and your enthusiasm for the programming that we've offered throughout that time. We hear from a lot of you that you've found it really rewarding and engaging, and we are so happy to have been able to offer that service and connect you with all this interesting conversation about books and authors and writing. So again, thank you for being here. So as I said, you're already chatting in the chat. Please keep on chatting. But toward the end of our conversation, we're going to take some audience questions. And to make that a little bit easier for us, rather than posting your questions in the chat, if I could ask you please to put them down in that Ask a Question area that you'll see at the bottom in the middle of your screen. That makes it a whole lot easier for us when that part of the program comes up. Another fun thing about that is that you can look at other people's questions, and if you have the same question, you can upvote it so it moves it to the top of the pile. So please engage in that, if you will. While we're looking at that part of the screen, I'd invite you to raise your eyeballs just a little bit and look at that long green bar that says your support is vital to the Mark Twain House and Museum. Please donate here. It has been a real long haul for every nonprofit, every museum, and we've all been very deeply grateful for people like yourselves who have kept us afloat during these trying times. The Mark Twain House and Museum for many, many months was closed to the public because of COVID and was not able to take advantage of its major revenue source, which is its wonderful guided house tour. We were really happy to be able to offer that tour for many months during 2021, but the latest COVID situation has required the Mark Twain House as an abundance of caution to close down once again for those house tours. I believe they're opening back up on the 21st, but in the meantime, the museum has been without that revenue stream. So what does that mean? That means that all the work that's being done by the staff is being done without a lot of income coming in. So I just bring this all up by way of saying that on behalf of the Mark Twain House and its staff and board of trustees, I'd like to say that anything that you're able to share, and I know this COVID thing is wearing on everybody and getting a little bit old, but if you're able to share $5, $50, whatever you can part with to help keep the Mark Twain House in good shape and able to continue offering this kind of programming. I know that every single penny is appreciated, and I know for sure that every single penny is put to very good use. So thank you in advance for that. Thank you also to our sponsors. Tonight's program, like all of our virtual programs, is sponsored by the Wish You Well Foundation and by Connecticut Public, WNPR. And it's produced in part with support honoring the legacy of Frank Lord, who was a beloved late trustee of the museum. So we're always honored to offer these programs to mark his legacy. We do all kinds of programs, virtual, and increasingly we'll be doing them in person. To learn more about those, visit marktwainhouse.org. Now I'd like to introduce our guests. Susan Campbell, who is a dear friend of the Mark Twain House and has done a lot of these programs with us, as a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, a widely read Hartford Courant columnist, and the author of 2 books, with a third forthcoming. Can't wait to hear more about that. She's worked across the media landscape as an award-winning print journalist, a regular commentator on WNPR, and many other places. She's also part of the Connecticut Health Investigative Team, an award-winning health and safety website. And I could go on about Susan Campbell. Thomas Crowl is a veterinarian you might be surprised to hear, in Ohio. But he's also an amateur social historian and has published several articles in Timeline, History Magazine, and Man at Arms, and of course is the author of tonight's book, Queen of the Con. So everybody, please join me in welcoming Thomas Crowl and Susan Campbell to tonight's talk, and give them just a moment for them to mic up. Welcome, Thomas. Welcome, Susan. Thank you for being here with us this evening.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
Me as well.
Now that you're on the screen, I'd like to point out that in the chat, there's a mention of an opportunity to purchase a signed copy of Queen of the Con. And know that if you purchase from the Mark Twain House, you get a signed copy, and also your purchase benefits the Mark Twain House and Museum. So please consider doing that if you can. So I'm going to sit back and enjoy the talk with everybody else. Susan, will you let me know when it's time to come back up and help with the Q&A?
I will do that. Thank you.
All right. Well, have fun. I'll see you in a little bit.
Thanks. Oh my gosh, Tom, I have questions. I have so many questions. So for people who haven't read the book yet, do you mind just giving a synopsis about Queen of the Con, who this is about?
Well, it's the first true non-story history of the life of Cassie Chadwick, which was her final alias and what she's most known as, who was one of the greatest con artists of the late 19th and early 20th century in America. And what she's most known for is impersonating Andrew Carnegie's illegitimate daughter. And she used this impersonation to borrow large amounts of money from banks and financiers all over Northern Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, Massachusetts. She got around.
I don't even know what to call her. Do we call her Cassie or Betsy? She was born Betsy Bigley in Canada, yes. But Cassie's better?
Well, she's known as Cassie Chadwick. Her last trial, she was tried as Cassie Chadwick. It's nowhere near her original name, but the nice thing about that particular era was if you didn't like your name, it wasn't hard to be somebody else.
I have to say the nice thing about that particular era too is that there was such a thing as promissory notes that allowed her to con so many businessmen, right? She never went for business. Well, there probably weren't a lot of business women, but right. She went for businessmen. She went for financiers, bankers. Can you explain what a promissory note allows one to do or allowed one to do?
Right. Well, these were personal promissory notes, which in the 19th century circulated and were almost used as you would use a check or cash today. Essentially, an individual, and it could be anyone, although it was usually people who were well-to-do and had some amount of money. If they had a debt that they needed to pay, if they needed to pay the grocer or whatever, instead of a check or something, or if they wanted to buy something expensive, they would simply write out a promissory note that said basically that I will pay you on said date so many $1,000 and I'll pay you so much interest between now and then. And these could be as short as a couple of weeks or as long as years, just depended on the situation.
Were they widely used?
Yes, they were widely used. You could actually buy the blank ones in most stationery stores in those days. You could just walk in and buy blank ones and fill in the blanks and sign it. They were rarely recorded. So this was a sort of thing where it really depended on the creditworthiness of the individual who was signing the note. And you had to make the decision if you were going to accept that note, whether you thought that person was good for the money or not. But of course, honor had a great deal to do with it. You know, it had to do with a man's honor, whether or not he would pay his notes. And obviously, if you didn't, it didn't help you much in the business world or anything else.
So, but Cassie Chadwick, we'll go with that, was not signing these promissory notes for herself. She did not have money.
No, but she was forging them, which was the next best thing in her case. Um, and that was the problem with promissory notes, which was a recognized issue at the time, was that, you know, you have to understand in the 19th century, it was much more difficult to determine a person's identity than it is today. And there were no driver's licenses, no social security numbers, none of the sorts of things that you use for identification today, no passports, you know, all that kind of stuff. So essentially, anybody could sign anybody's name to a promissory note. And if you found a banker, or if you found another individual who was willing to accept it, then, you know, they would take it. Banks often dealt in these notes. In other words, if they knew that if they were sure they knew who this prominent person was, and that he was well known in town or whatever, and that he was good for the money, what they would do, you could take the note. If he paid you a note, you could take that note to the bank and say, hey, how much will you give me for this note that's due in a year? And they would, what they call, discount it. So if you had a note, we'll just use round figures here, that was $1,000, the bank might say, well, we know this guy and he's pretty good for it, so we'll give you 700. So you could take the 700, give the bank the note. Then when the note was due in a year, he had to pay the bank the note and the interest, because the bank owned the note.
Would there be any attempt to address or contact the person whose signature was at the bottom of the promissory note to say, hey, is this legit, or was it just assumed?
Well, that depends, because what worried people, well, the bankers didn't want the notes to be picked up or paid before they were due, because then they would lose out on the interest and some of the profit that they were going to make. So a lot of times they didn't ask the person who had it. The person who signed the note might get up one morning and, you know, there's a letter from the bank that said, oh, I got your note and it's due, you know, how about, you know. So that was part of the problem. There was lots of problems with them, but it was one way that people financed an awful lot of things in the 19th century.
So for the criminally minded in the audience tonight, is that still an option where we can get, I can sign Thomas Crowl to the bottom of a promissory note and go buy my...
Well, what you would find is how bad my credit really is if you try to take that to the bank. So, you know, in reality, we don't use promissory notes that way. When you signed an installment loan contract, it's a similar sort of thing.
Okay.
You know, and so if you want to go in and forge somebody's name on an installment contract and try to buy a car, you're welcome to it, but I don't think you're going to get very far.
Okay, so everybody in the audience, stay in school.
Yeah, absolutely.
We set up the con. That's basically how she moved through the world, is pretending a relationship with rich people that allowed her to get money from other rich people.
More or less, but she was, when it came to fraud, she was equal opportunity. She engaged in blackmail. She engaged in forgery. She kited checks, which was, you know, basically playing the float. She did all of those kinds of things. And towards the end of her career, the time she spent as Cassie Chadwick in Cleveland and other places, most of what she did had to deal with using Carnegie's signature on various documents to get money. Now, the interesting thing was that it was not illegal for you to sign my name to a promissory note. That was not illegal. What was illegal was when you tried to cash it in.
Why would I sign your name to a promissory note if I wasn't going to cash it in?
That would make sense. And that's why all the state laws had the two basically attached. You had to forge it and try to pass it.
Does this mean I have a criminal mind? Because I came to I didn't like her as I was reading it, but I came to admire, one, her utter lack of morals and her moxie.
Mm-hmm.
Can we back up just a bit? So now we know.
Yes, yes.
I feel like when I was reading your book, which is exhaustively researched, the way her family, who were not a bunch of criminals, explained her behavior, my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, was that she'd had a high fever as a child, and they thought that that had to do with the twist in her brain that allowed her to do or say whatever she wanted to do or say to acquire wealth.
Yes, that was their explanation.
So she was born in Canada in a
Yeah.
regular family on a farm.
Yes.
None
I think
of
there were
them-
like 8 in the family. It was a big family.
It was a small family.
Well, big family, really.
Yeah, it really was. But
Yeah.
no pretensions from that family, or nothing that would say, oh, look, we're going to have one bad egg. And then she uses her father's job at a railroad to get a ticket to blow out of there.
Yeah,
And-
she couldn't wait to leave home.
And it's just so strange from that upbringing, or what you can suppose was that upbringing, that she would be such a con artist, that she would acquire the knowledge how to do it and then execute it. It was like she had no shame.
Well, she didn't. I mean, from a very young age, she wanted to be wealthy. She
Okay.
wanted to have the things that she saw that other people who had money had that she didn't have. And she was prepared to do whatever it took to do that. And she had the single-minded purpose to continue to do that through her entire life.
Right.
I mean, she went to prison for 4 years for it, and that didn't change her. She just kept going till the day she died. She just kept going, and that was I mean, that was a career. I mean, that,
Yeah.
a true career. It wasn't like it was just a part-time thing. That was what she devoted her life to.
And she dipped her toe in spiritualism. That seemed to be her entree into the public world, was that she was a medium, or said
Well, I know that you've done some research yourself on spiritualism and so forth. And to be honest, the difference between what she did and what you've researched and written about is an ocean apart. She was basically a fortune teller.
Okay.
And she would do things like people would come to her, mostly men, and they would ask her about, lottery tickets. They would ask her about grain futures. They would ask her about excising evil spirits, this kind of stuff.
Right.
And she charged for that. And whether she had any results or not, I don't know. You be I guess the person who paid for it was the judge. Was he happy or wasn't he happy?
But that also gave her entree to business people who would want to know grain futures, or want to know, which opened the door for relationships there.
Well, I think one of the interesting things that I learned in this was that in that particular time, mistresses and prostitutes had a great opportunity to learn information from their clients, which they could then turn around and profit from.
Yep.
If they were smart enough to do that. And a lot of them were, and they could, use that money to invest in stocks, insider trading, that kind of thing, So, yes, she learned a great deal by doing some of these things and by talking to these people and finding out about things and learning about investments and that sort of thing. She was smart enough to do all this and to connect the dots.
Right.
The average, inmate in a brothel wasn't that smart, but she was. So,
can I ask, how did you stumble across her? I had never heard of her in my life, and I thought I knew more than I do.
Well, I was researching something now. I don't remember, another book that I was working on, and I happened to stumble across her, a reference to her.
Yeah.
And I keep a file of things that come up when I'm doing something else because it seemed interesting, and I'll throw it in the file and then look later. And so I did some basic research about her and thought, this is a whale of a story. There are a couple of books that were written. These are strictly fiction. The authors in both cases used a few basic historical facts, and from that they built them into something they weren't.
Mhm.
The one book was entitled Gold Brick Cassie, which should give you some idea what the book was about. It was a paperback from the 1970s, and one of those kind of things. She just the whole thing, she just was so interesting.
Yeah.
And then the deeper I got into it, the more interesting she became. That I certainly thought she deserved a book, and that a book would be pretty entertaining at the same time.
Did you abandon the book you were researching when you found her?
No.
Did you finish that book?
Yes. Yeah,
What's
I
the
did.
name of it, if you could share it?
I think that was Murder of a Journalist, which was
Okay.
about the murder of Don Millette in Canton by gangsters in
Yeah.
1926. Yeah.
So you like crime.
Well, as I've told you before, crime sells. So if you're going to write a book, you might like to sell a few copies. So
tell me about your well, let me ask this. When you write a biography like this, and how long did it take you researching and writing this book? How long did you spend with Cassie?
Oh, probably 3 to 4 years.
Okay.
And I'll tell you something here brand new tonight that nobody else has heard. I didn't even tell my publisher this, but I wrote a book about Cassie about 10 years ago, or little less than 10. And
Yeah.
I sent it to the same publisher, Kent State.
Yeah.
And they flat out rejected it. And they made some valid criticisms. They were right. The book needed a complete rewrite and redoing. So I did it. I came back with the book like 8 or 10 years later. Entirely different group of people at the press. And they were very excited about it. So I guess the bottom line is, it never hurts to be persistent.
That's true. And that's a hell of a rewrite 8 to 10 years later. You must have been working on it. So that makes this next question more interesting. When you spend that much time with a person and you're looking through court documents and trying to, were there much, let me get this out. Did she leave many personal papers? That would have been stupid of her, huh? Yeah.
No, the remarkable thing about the woman, I have to say, is that she went through 3 criminal trials.
Mm-hmm.
She never testified. She never left any no biography, no notes that were worth of anything, no comments. She didn't even write anything in the margins particularly. There were a handful of letters that survived that are in Cleveland in a historical society because she sent them to a lawyer that she was working with at the time. He kept them, and his estate kept them, and they got handed down that way. Gives you a tiny bit of, and those are in the book. Some of that's in the book. Gives you a little bit of an insight into her. But she, a lot of criminals, they want to brag and they want to talk about what they did and all. She kept her mouth shut. There was one time she agreed, after she was her final conviction, before she went off to prison, that she agreed to talk to a reporter.
Yeah.
And there was a group of reporters that followed her around everywhere with the trial and before and after. And so she said, pick one from the pool and I'll talk to him, but he can't ask me any questions. So would you take that interview?
Yeah, I would. With her,
did.
I would. Totally.
He did. And she went off and from what I can see, maybe half of what she said was true and the other half was kind of self-serving, and that was pretty much it.
But if you're a con woman, how stupid do you have to be to keep a diary? Today, I screwed Andrew Carnegie out of this much money.
Exactly.
Yeah.
She never, and she kept her mouth shut. I mean, it wasn't like she was spilling her guts and blaming somebody else about everything. It was like, hey.
I know she didn't seem terribly upset. I mean, I'm sure she was upset when she was caught. There are some scenes in the book where it looks like, no one wants to be in prison, but did you like her?
That's a good question. And my publisher, they said, well, was she a feminist? Was she a suffragette? Was she all of these things? And I said, I'm really sorry. I'd like to think she was all those, but in truth, she was nothing but a career criminal.
Yeah.
So you got to take that with a little bit. So yeah, I admire some of the things that when you look at the thinking and some of the thought processes and how did she keep all these balls in the air at the same time?
Right.
You got to admire that. But on the other hand, she's a career criminal, so you can't really fall too much in love with her.
We should announce that Thomas Crowl had a career as a veterinarian, mostly kept his nose clean. Is that accurate?
Mostly, yes.
Mostly. Tell us about writing. You were a veterinarian, which doesn't necessarily give you a lot of opportunity to write.
Well, James Herriot did pretty good with it, but I'm not James Herriot, and I didn't write about veterinary medicine. It was just a hobby that I got started doing, writing some magazine articles and that sort of thing. And from there, it just kind of grew, to be honest. And perhaps there's some of your listeners out there who can identify with this. I got tired of dealing with magazine editors. So I decided, I can do these. I can write a book. It's just putting a bunch of the articles together, right? So I started out and did that. The first book I wrote was Murder of a Journalist. Mm-hmm. And I thought, well, I'm going to send this off to a couple of publishers and see if anybody's interested. But I said, it'll take months before I hear anything. And so I'll have plenty of time to polish my manuscript and everything. I sent it to Kent, and 2 weeks later, they got back to me and said, we want to see your manuscript.
Wow.
Well, unfortunately, the manuscript wasn't quite ready for prime time. So I had to stall them for a couple of weeks while I, kind of cleaned it up a little bit. But, and whether, I guess, let's be honest, I must be lucky as hell because every book I've ever written, that's what's happened.
That or you know how to write. That might be part of it too.
Well, I'll leave that to other people to judge.
That's noble of you. I mentioned earlier that the book is incredibly detailed to details about the court cases. Did you go look at court records? Were you reading old newspapers? How did you do all this research and get this in?
Well, I've read old newspapers to death. I mean, that's what a lot of this is based on, the newspaper accounts. Now, I checked with the court in the Northern District of Ohio where she was last tried. And I think she was tried in 1905, and the archivist said, we threw everything before 1912 away. So there wasn't any court records that I could find. And I couldn't find any in Toledo either. It was like, yeah, what do you want? This was like 120 years ago. We haven't got this kind of stuff laying around. So I had to piece it together. That's what made this more difficult than you might normally think, because I had to piece all the newspaper accounts together. Believe me, that's difficult from the 19th century because, well, newspapers were the primary media. And what I learned a lot about newspapers in the first book I wrote, because that was about an editor. So I knew a little bit about how they worked in the last part of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, but you may or may not know this. In the 19th century, for big stories like this in the early 20th, a city editor would send his reporters out and tell them to interview people, to get, tap their sources and all this kind of stuff. Go hang around the courthouse. If it was a trial on, go sit in the trial and take notes. But then they gave the city editor their notes, and he had to write the story from the notes.
Without being there. Yeah.
Without being there. So you can imagine, you're getting it like second or third hand by the time, the city editor's done with it. Yeah. But it made it increasingly difficult. And then you try to piece these things together. Newspapers often shared articles. Out-of-town newspapers would share articles back and forth and so forth. And then sometimes they put their own spin on them a little bit, or try to personalize them a little bit as if that might help. So yeah, it's kind of difficult to get through all of that, to get to the truth. The biggest part is trying to make a timeline where you get everything in the right order, because newspapers go through different editions in those days. I mean, they had like the big city papers that have like 3 or 4 editions a day. Yeah. So every one might be a little different. And if they had a court trial going on and court was still in session at 3:00 when the deadline was for the final edition, well, the notes went out of the courthouse and down to the city editor, and the reporter sat there and continued taking notes. And so when the papers came out, well, did this happen yesterday or did this happen today? And so it was challenging. It was an interesting time. It was like a puzzle putting some of those things together.
Wasn't the writing wonderful? I love newspaper writing from the late.
Oh,
early. Well,
yes. Those guys, yeah, it was amazing what most
they
of
let
what,
it rip. It was like,
no, they did. They could, and of course, I'm not afraid to tell you that I used in the original draft of this book, I used the descriptions that reporters wrote of what people looked like.
yeah.
Especially women.
We don't get to do that now. That's not.
No, I got, my publisher says you're going to have to,
Can you remember any of
clean
them?
that up.
How they described Cassie? Do you remember? Miss Chadwick, I guess I should say.
Oh, it varied, of course, because at one point when she had her first set of trials, she was still a young and very attractive woman with a good figure, and we needn't go into all the details. And then when she got to the final trials as Cassie Chadwick, she was only in her 40s, but she looked 10 years older. And she never smiled. She had this constant scowl on her face. Well, she had dentures, ill-fitting dentures. And just like George Washington never smiled with his dentures, she never smiled with hers. And she was also deaf. Pretty much, she was probably only had about 25% of her hearing. One ear was totally deaf and the other one was about half. So she didn't hear things real well.
Yeah.
And for a while, although at first when she was, younger, people talked about her. She had a lisp that was supposedly quite attractive. I don't know how that works, but anyway. So this was something they mentioned a lot too. But that's how it sort of kind of got lost as things went along.
But even though, she could pass through a crowd and heads maybe wouldn't turn as she got older or even younger, was she utterly charming? Was she able to charm people?
Well, I wouldn't say heads didn't turn when she was older, because she had this imperious sort of attitude that, she stayed in probably the second best hotel in New York City. And she could sweep in, and there would be, and this hotel was also a residential hotel for wealthy women. And they would be gathered at the lobby or in the restaurant or whatever, and she would sweep in and everybody would see her. She made an entrance. She might not have been smiling and she might not have been the most attractive woman, but she made an entrance.
Which is more important anyway.
Well, I guess so. So, she was, she knew how to play. She was a superb actress, which is something we haven't taught. She was a very good actress. She put this on, this is a Canadian farm girl who grew up poor on a farm in rural Ontario. Yeah. And, at the end of her career, she could have held her own with any of the wealthy women, any Vanderbilts or any of those that you might read about.
And Andrew Carnegie never really, one of her cons, maybe one of the better known cons, was that she was the illegitimate daughter of, I don't think we use illegitimate anymore, but she was the daughter Andrew Carnegie was to have fathered outside of wedlock.
Okay, we can make it politically correct for today if you wish.
What was his response to her claim?
He laughed about it. He joked about it. Of course, he famously said that, well, the woman proved that my credit is still good.
Because she used his name.
Yeah.
To get money.
And he never publicly disavowed her.
But she wasn't.
No, it doesn't seem that she was. But there were people, even her defense attorneys, who thought that in some way she knew Carnegie. Some way, somehow, she knew Carnegie. She was that good. that good at convincing people.
You wrote a scene where she has a gentleman with her that she's trying to con. They travel to Carnegie's New York mansion.
Oh, yeah.
She goes and is admitted, and the gentleman is staying in the carriage.
Right.
She's admitted. She comes out with a promissory note or notes signed by Andrew Carnegie. She comes out, and it looks absolutely plausible that she went in and sort of coyly said, "Let it be known that's her father," without saying it.
Yeah, I mean, that was of course, that particular story is probably partially fictionized, but it's got enough truth to it that I put it in the book because I tend to believe that at least parts of it were true. But she totally conned this lawyer who was with her into believing that she was Carnegie's daughter, because they just drove right up to Carnegie's Fifth Avenue mansion, and she got out, went up to the door, knocked, they let her in.
Right.
She told the housekeeper she wanted to talk to her about hiring a former employee, and they spent 20 minutes gabbing about that.
Yeah.
And when she leaves, she gets in the carriage, she accidentally drops a package or her purse or something that she had, and a couple of promissory notes fall out with Carnegie's name on them. I mean, really, some actresses today would be doing well to pull that off.
Holy cow. Do we have cons like her today?
Well, yes, we do, as a matter of fact. We just finished with the trial of what's her name, Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos. There's that one.
Okay.
There's Rita Crudwell in Illinois, Dixon, Illinois, Ronald Reagan's birthplace, who managed to, as the controller of the city, managed to steal $50 million over 20 years before she got caught. There was a Russian emigre, I forget her name, Anna something, or Anita or Ika. Anyway, she claimed she was worth $10 million and got money, and she's doing time in Virginia, I guess. So, I mean, they're still out there. They're still working. And if you look really close at this, you'll see that some of these cons that they did are the same kind of things that are in your inbox from Nigeria or wherever they come from. I mean, it's still there, and it wouldn't be there if it didn't work. So somebody must be falling for it.
No, I feel really stupid that I wouldn't know how to be a con, but now I kind of want to be, because there's a lot of money in it. And if you can manage to not get caught, I'm only kidding. Was there a Mark Twain connection between?
Oh, I wish there was, but I did not find any Mark Twain. But as I said, we were talking earlier, as I said, I don't think Twain had enough money for her. And let's face it, Andrew Carnegie he and John D. Rockefeller were the two wealthiest Americans in 1900. And she didn't choose John D. Rockefeller because he had lived on Euclid Avenue in Cleveland. He was well known in Cleveland, and it was going to be hard. Whereas Carnegie was way over in Pittsburgh, all of 70 miles away or something. And he wasn't as well known, so it was a little easier to do that. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Man, it would be fast. Did you ever I've had this happen to me where I've written about someone who's passed, and I wish I could just have 15 minutes with them, the actual person, to talk to them. What would you ask her? What the hell?
I think, people have asked me this before, and I think I would ask her, was it worth it?
That's good. Yeah.
She died in prison.
Yep.
She was convicted twice. She spent 4 years in the Ohio penitentiary at first, and then the second time they sent her back down there, even though she was a federal prisoner. She was the first female federal prisoner, I think, locked up in the old Ohio pen. And she died in prison. She died alone in prison. But, was the good life she lived between prison stints and before, was it, worth it? Yeah.
We'll want to go to everyone. I see we have questions. I just had one more, and
sure.
I'm not trying to resurrect her or somehow rehabilitate her, but is there anything we can learn from her life other than how to launch a con?
Well, I think we can learn that, and I think this was something that, and this was one of the reasons that the con worked, is that big cons tend to work best at times when there's a lot of social change going on. And at that particular point in time in America, there was a lot of social change, especially with women who were, the suffrage movement was going on, women's rights and all those sorts of things. And I think that the things you can learn from that is that women were every bit as capable of doing everything that a man could do in that time period, even if men weren't willing to give them the opportunity to do so.
So Cassie just took the opportunity.
She took it.
Yeah. Okay.
She grabbed it and ran with it.
A lesson for all of us. I'll call back up Jennifer if she's listening.
Oh, am I ever? My goodness, what a fascinating conversation. My head is spinning right now, and I just love the way this is such a story of its era. But as you point out, Tom, it has parallels and resonates in our current day as well. And that's the best kind of story to read. So thank you so much. And Susan, thank you for your awesome, as always, preparation and your great questions. So yes, our audience, as usual, has some really great questions. Our dear friend Ann O'Brien and Bob O'Brien ask, how soon in her career did Andrew Carnegie become aware of her?
Well, I think
what's the timeline there?
When she first started signing things until it actually all came crashing down was about 3 years.
Okay.
About 3 years. She used his promissory notes and a supposed trust agreement that he had signed that gave her like $10 or $12 million or something. She used those to borrow and to cover other debts. Her eventual downfall was because she completely cleaned out an entire national bank in Oberlin, Ohio. She took every penny they had. When there was a run on the bank, when they found out she had been there, there was a run on the bank that there wasn't enough money to pay the depositors.
Wow.
And the bank went under. Well, here's one for you. Guess who bailed all the depositors out of the bank in Oberlin? Andrew Carnegie. Guess who gave Oberlin a new library as a little extra? Andrew Carnegie. So, it was actually a good ending for Oberlin in a lot of respects.
That's kind of mind-boggling, though. It kind of makes you wonder, why he went to such extents to make things right. Yeah, a little bit. So Catherine White says, how do you research someone who went to such lengths to disguise her identity? Did you ever lose her trail in your research? Good question, Catherine. Thank you.
No, her crimes were so large, it was hard to lose track of her for very long. There was one point prior to when she came to Toledo, which was in the late 1880s, when at that time she was calling herself Madame Devere. She was a spiritualist and a clairvoyant and all this sort of thing. And people tried to track her movements because there was a time between when she left Cleveland and ended up in Toledo. Where was she? And there were stories of her being in Columbus, Cincinnati, out in Kansas, if you will,
wow.
and pulling cons in all of those places. But a lot of those things were attributed to her after she was arrested and became famous. So it was kind of like, well, that must have been her, whether it was her. So she got accused of a whole lot of things that she didn't really do just because she was who she was.
Yeah, and that makes sense. So Anne, again, O'Brien and Judy have kind of related questions. Anne wants to know, were you able to find any information about how Cassie spent the money she garnered, any notable luxuries? And then Judy says, what did you have to say when you got a promissory note? Did you have to say what it was for, like a mortgage or for another purchase?
No, you did not have to say what the promissory note was for.
Okay.
They weren't even signed by witnesses. I mean, it was kind of an interesting thing.
Kind of a good deal.
Yes. The other part of the question was what again about the?
What did she spend the money on?
Oh yeah, well that's interesting because they had an auction. She was declared bankrupt, and they had an auction of her property, And there's a chapter on it in the book that basically tells about all the things that she bought. Apparently, she didn't have very good taste, but she bought a lot of stuff. Now, the last thing about her money, she had a son, Emil, her illegitimate, I'll use that term, son, and he was in his early 20s when she died. At the time, he was living in Cleveland. After she died, he disappeared. And I don't mean he just disappeared. I mean, and I've tried to find, what happened to him, and I don't know what happened to him. But the prosecutors and the various people who were trying to find the money that she had taken because she was bankrupt and they had creditors to pay and so forth, they all thought that she had more money than what they were able to locate. And I'd say there's a fairly good bet that her son was well taken care of after her death. How much and where he went and what he did, I'd love to know. And truthfully, I'm still looking. I'd still like to find the answer to that question.
That's fascinating. And so since you've mentioned her son, Elliot Tarlin wants to know, did she have any genuine personal relationships outside of her cons and scams?
Now, that's a good question. And I'll go with, the obvious one to go with is Dr. Leroy Chadwick, whom she married in Cleveland and became Cassie Chadwick and so forth. But I'm going to go with something a little less. I alluded to it in the book, but I didn't really. Her son, Emil, was supposedly the offspring of a somewhat corrupt Cleveland councilman. He may have been a Democrat. And he had a great deal to do with taking care of her throughout a lot of her time, her early years anyway. So she had the child when she was in her late 20s. And when she was caught in Toledo and tried, he paid for her defense. He even sent a expensive Cleveland lawyer to Toledo to help with her defense. She had 3 people on her defense team in Toledo. So she goes to prison, but somebody pays enough money into the account that she can have a few little luxuries, and she can doesn't have to eat prison food. They send it in from outside and all that sort of thing. She gets out of prison, and she got out of prison. That's interesting. She tried to get out of prison on parole on a number of different occasions and didn't. But finally, she was paroled by Ohio Governor William McKinley, who 2 years later was President William McKinley. So she obviously had friends in high places. And then when she became Cassie Chadwick, she got into trouble with the Customs Service because they accused her of bringing gemstones into the country from Europe without paying the duty on them. Well, who did she go to for help? She went to Mark Hanna, Ohio Senator Mark Hanna, who is also known as the man who put William McKinley in the White House because he was sort of like the fundraiser, campaign manager kind of guy. So he vouched for her. He said, she's okay, leave her alone. And they did. So she had friends in high places, and this former lover, the father of her child, he took care of her, and he died somewhere in the mid-90s, I guess they say. He was never publicly identified in anything that I ever found. I have a couple of good candidates in mind because I researched that pretty heavily, but I don't have any way of proving it or saying who it was. But when she got out of prison, she was penniless, supposedly. And 2 years later, she had over 50 expensive French gowns, and she owned a bunch of row houses in Cleveland. That's a pretty fast recovery for a convict, especially in the 1890s.
Wow, she's fascinating. So Diana Kramer, who is one of our wonderful volunteers at the Twain House and a dear friend, asks, was sex part of her con? Did she use sex to coerce?
In the very, very early years when she was young, she probably did a little bit. She was not, people have often wanted to accuse her of being a prostitute in one way or another, but I don't really think she did that much. I really think that she was clever. She would do things or get situations going where she could blackmail someone and that kind of thing. But basically, no, sex was not a big part of her repertoire as far as being a con artist goes. We could get into it, and this is discussions in the book about houses of assignation versus brothels and that sort of thing. But she was clever. She knew how to make these things pay. And as we talked about earlier, with the information that she could collect in these situations, she learned a lot from that as well, and made a lot of connections too through some of that stuff that she did. So directly, no; indirectly, yes.
Gotcha. That was a really good answer. Thank you. So while I move to the next question, I'm going to just pause. Linda Christensen says, I'd love to see a picture. So my first response to that, before Susan jumps to, I can see she's going to help us out here. I would suggest, click that link in the chat and purchase your signed copy through the Mark Twain House and know that you get to see pictures there. But maybe Susan will share just a little preview. Give us if you could hold up
by the book.
There you go.
Wow, I could be Vanna White.
Right? You could
actually
be.
The bottom is her two mug shots. The one on the left is her as Madame Devere, and the one on the right is her as Cassie Chadwick. At the bottom, the pictures on the bottom, and at the top, the one is her in her 30s probably, and then the one on the right is her as Cassie Chadwick with the expensive gown. The black and white really doesn't do her gowns justice, obviously, but that's how the pictures were taken then. But yeah, she was.
Here's one of her promissory notes.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so interesting to see.
Don't try to cash that.
Right.
Marcia has a really good question too. Do you think that she enjoyed the con more than the outcome of the cons?
Oh, I try to keep this simple. She wanted the money. She didn't care how she got the money, honestly. If she got the money by doing blackmail, that was okay. If she got the money on a con, that was okay. If she made the money legitimately in the stock market, that was okay. It really didn't. Is that the ghost of Mark Twain?
Yes, it is. My mouse has slid off my table twice now, and I'm so sorry. It's broken. I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, I think that's all. Really, she was after the money, and she didn't really care how she got it.
Well, fair enough. Sorry that I kind of lost track of the questions because my mouse broke. So there are a couple questions about geography. Mickey Pfeffer, another dear friend of the Twain House, says, she stayed in the general area most of her career, a state or two. And Faith Miller says, why did she settle in Ohio?
Well, she got it after when she was a kid in an early 20s. She got into a lot of trouble in Canada. Her family sent her to live with an older sister who lived in Cleveland. So that's how she got into Cleveland. And then when she did the Madame Devere con business, she went to Toledo, which is just not that far from Cleveland, like 80 miles or something, on the other down the lake shore, down Lake Erie. When she was Cassie Chadwick in Cleveland, she spent a good deal of her time in Europe. They spent a lot of time in Europe. She spent time in New York, a lot of time in New York, liked the hotels, liked the restaurants, liked the shopping. Her last con that got her into the most trouble, the biggest problem she had with that fellow, he was in Boston. So even you New Englanders were at risk. And she kept expanding wherever she could go to find money. Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh, there's a really good bit in the book there about her and an industrialist named James Friend in Pittsburgh, who was probably at the time he was in Pittsburgh, after Carnegie had left, he was probably the wealthiest man in Pittsburgh, and how he actually got her to take some money as a loan in order to launder it for him so that he could take the money he had stolen from a partner, launder it through her, and then get it back. And that was almost $1 million right there. So she got around. She did definitely get around.
A lot of effort and energy put into all of this, and wonder what she could have done if she had just had a job or done something.
Well,
else
that's what the Cleveland Plain Dealer opinion. That's what their opinion or their op-ed piece at the time was, that if she had been a business with a little better management, she might have made a lot of people rich. Which in a lot of ways is true, because she, even though she was she had an uncanny ability to borrow money. I mean, most of us, you got to jump through hoops and stuff to borrow money today. But I mean, she was able to, at a time when a wage of, when somebody made $500 a year, working men made $500 a year, she refused loans of $30,000. People just, there were a lot of people that rejected her. I mean, it's not like she was 100, she batted 100%, but just like these cons today with the Nigerians and stuff, where they send out blasts of email, you don't need 100% return. You only need a few to be successful.
Wow.
And that's my words of wisdom on being a con artist, Susan, if you're interested.
Let me write that down.
We should write that down for future reference.
Oh, so we've just got a few more minutes, and there are some related questions. There's a lot of buzz here in the question and answers about films and movies. And Carol, our wonderful volunteer, wants to know if you've been approached about film rights. And Neil Rubenstein says he's written a movie script, Queen Bee, about Cassie, and he's currently attempting to get Charlize Theron to play this anti-hero that the audience would root for. So can you tell us, has there been any movie interest, and what do you think about Charlize as the star?
Well, I would be very happy to see the thing turned into a movie, obviously. I mean, that would be. And I know that there was someone working, I don't know if that's this particular individual, and there was someone working on a movie, and they had put something online. This has been about 2 years ago, before COVID struck. And they had talked about how they were going to start production and all the rest of this kind of stuff. But the more I read it, the more I got the impression that it was mostly meant to preempt other people from using the idea, more than it was that they were that ready to go with a movie. I think a movie would be an excellent thing. On the other hand, I have kind of mixed emotions, because there's always a certain amount of artistic license that has to be taken with entertainment. And so, I don't want them to turn Cassie into a caricature, because she's not. She was a lot more than that and deserves a lot more than that. So if there was a screenplay available that, I understand there has to be certain, changes, certain things they have to do in order to make it a good movie, but entertaining. But by the same token, if they could do something that wouldn't necessarily detract from what she actually did and how she did it, I think that would be excellent to see a movie. Yeah. And as far as actresses go, I'm sure there's a lot of people who would be good for that part. And it would all depend on the screenplay, right? That's what movies, if there's a good screenplay, then I don't think they'll have trouble finding actors.
Oh, sure.
Or financing in today's world.
So Tom, what are you working on next?
I'm just digging into a few things right now. I really haven't. The way this process works for me is that I'll find these things. I'll look through. I'll do some preliminary research to see if anybody, see how much information is there, and to see if anybody else has done a book recently, for example, because I'm not going to repeat what somebody else just did.
Sure.
So I'll go through and do all that. And then I'll look and see if there's enough material to make a full book. There's a heck of a lot of stories out there that would make good books, but there isn't enough material to make a book. And I'm not going to use fiction to fluff it up. That's not the way I prefer to write. So if I can find that it's got enough. So right now I'm in the process of looking at some things and seeing if there's enough material for me to pull together for a book. And I don't work on a timeline, so who knows how long that'll take.
Well, will you keep us posted, please? And perhaps we can reconvene. Susan, will you come back when Tom's next book comes out, and we can do this again?
Well, God willing, and the creek don't rise,
There
I
you
hope
go.
pretty soon.
Thank you, Susan. I was just going to ask if you would hold the book up again. I want to thank our audience. As always, you've been really great, and love your questions and appreciate them very much, and appreciate your support and appreciate your donations. Susan and Thomas, thank you so much for sharing this evening with us. And what an interesting, fascinating, we could go on for a longer time, but so I do want to remind people that this has been recorded. It will be available to view at marktwainhouse.org if you looked at their digital programming. And another fun thing about this is that the chat remains live in perpetuity. So if you've started a conversation here in the chat, you can come back and continue it at any time you like. So go ahead and do that. And please do check out marktwainhouse.org for a list of all the upcoming programs offered. And again, I want to thank you both so much. Folks, buy the book.
Thank you.
You won't regret it.
It's been a pleasure. Enjoyed it. Thank you.
Same here.
Thanks,
Thank
Tom.
you so much.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody. Bye-bye.
night.